The snow had begun before they reached the gates. It fell without wind, which was the strange thing. Not driven sideways by the mountain weather that scoured the Ashenvale passes in early winter, but descending straight and deliberate, as though the sky had made a decision. Alara watched it through the barred window of the transport, for as long as the angle permitted, then looked instead at her hands. The iron around her wrists was cold. She had stopped feeling it, somewhere in the first hour, which was either a mercy or a warning. They brought her in through the eastern gate. She had understood what that meant the moment Chancellor Maren's soldiers appeared at her door in Ashenvale. 4 weeks ago, in the hour before dawn, when sleeping people are at their most honest about what frightens them. She had not been sleeping. She had stood at the window and watched the lantern light approaching through the snow, and felt something tighten in her chest that was not fear, and was not quite grief. And she had gone with them without resistance, not because she had no choice. There had been a moment, in the doorway, when she had considered the gap between the nearest soldier and the wall, had mapped the darkness, and the horses tethered at the road's edge. But running again meant exile for the rest of her life, and she had decided somewhere in the long silence of the third winter alone that she was finished with that particular direction. Whatever Varenholt had waiting for her was a fixed point. She stepped out of the transport into the cold, and the snow touched her face, and she looked up at the palace's south wing rising above her. Ancient stone, blackened by centuries of weather, the mortar grown thick, with moss now flattened and grey under winter's first pressure. And felt, not dread, but the particular sensation of a held breath approaching its end. 8 soldiers moved her through a series of service passages, lit by bracketed torches, their orange light turning everything it touched into something older than it was. She had been in these passages as a child, she thought, though not by this rote, and not under these particular conditions. Her mother had brought her through the palace's formal corridors in those years, through the rooms with high ceilings and tapestried walls, with a hand on her shoulder and instructions she had not fully understood about keeping her sleeve down, keeping her left hand closed, not meeting certain people's eyes. She understood now what those instructions had cost her mother to maintain. She had had 3 years to understand it, and she still had not reached the bottom of it. The passage opened into the hall of assembly. Vast, cold, its ceiling lost in shadow, even on days when the high windows admitted full sun, which today they did not. Pillars of pale granite rose along both sides, each carved at its base with the sigil of one of the 13 bloodlines. Faded now, worn smooth by centuries of hands touching them as people passed. The floor was dark and polished, and her boots made no sound on it. At the far end, beneath the great seal of the kingdom, inlaid in the stone in black and gold, Chancellor Maren stood waiting. He was dressed simply, which was how she knew it was a performance. She had grown up watching him. He had been her father's advisor first, then the Regency Council's voice, then simply the person who held Varenhold's institutional levers with hands so practiced they had grown invisible around them. She remembered thinking as a child that he looked like a priest. The careful stillness, the economy of gesture, the way he listened with his whole face and gave away nothing. She understood now that what she had mistaken for spiritual discipline was the cultivated patience of a man who had learned that information was more powerful than force, and that the most effective cage was one the occupant helped construct. He smiled when she entered, not widely, just enough. "You look well," he said, "for someone who has spent 3 years in the north." She said nothing. "The king has agreed to hear the matter of your return adjudicated formally. 4 votes to 3. Narrow but sufficient." He folded his hands before him. "The charge is treason. The specific act Concealment of lineage relevant to the succession, compounded by voluntary exile, interpreted as flight from lawful judgment. The concealment was not mine. No, he agreed pleasantly. It was your mother's, but she is not here to answer for it, and the blood that makes the matter relevant is yours. He tilted his head. I thought you should understand the shape of it before we proceed. Footsteps behind her, many measured in unison. She recognized the cadence before she turned, the synchronized step of ceremonial guard. The rhythm trained into them over years, designed to communicate that what was happening was sanctioned and orderly and therefore inevitable. She turned. 12 of them. Royal guards in full formal livery, black and gold, the king's own household regiment. Their captain was young, his jaw set with the tension of someone executing an assignment he does not entirely understand. He carried chains, not the rough iron of the transport, but formal chains, silver bright, clearly ceremonial, made for this purpose, planned long before her arrival. He stopped 2 paces from her and read from the writ he held. The words were bureaucratic and complete. When he finished, he looked up. I am ordered to bind your wrists. She held out her hands, not as a surrender. She held them out because she needed to see what happened when he tried. And she could not see it if she collapsed the moment before it resolved. The captain stepped forward. He looked at her wrists. The mark was there. It had always been there, which was why she had kept her sleeves long, in the years before exile, why her mother had kept it covered with cloth and instruction and the particular fear of women who understand exactly how much their silence is protecting. The shape of it was unmistakable to anyone trained to recognize it. The household guard were trained to recognize it. That was the thing Maren had not calculated, or had calculated and dismissed, or had decided he could manage. The fact that the guard's foundational oath was not sworn to the Regency Council, but to the bloodline itself. The captain stopped. He was looking at the mark. The silence lasted 5 seconds, long enough to change the room. Captain. Maren's voice had not risen, but its warmth had gone. What remained was still controlled, still precisely measured, but it was the control of a man applying pressure rather than a man at ease. You have your orders. The captain did not move. He stood with the chains held before him, and he looked at the mark on her wrist, and she could see the work happening behind his eyes. Not confusion, not fear, but the specific process of a person matching what they were trained to believe against what they were currently witnessing, and arriving at a conclusion that was larger than the room had prepared them for. She had seen that expression once before, years ago, on the face of the archivist, who had looked up from an old document and understood for the first time what it meant. She did not speak. She did not tell him what to do, did not incline her head, did not offer anything that could be read as instruction. Whatever he decided, she would know exactly where she stood. That was the thing she had needed to know since the transport stopped. He set the chains down. The sound they made on the stone floor was small. The room received it like a struck bell. Then he went to one knee. The motion was not graceful. It was the motion of a man moving before thought could intervene. The motion of a completed understanding expressing itself through the body before the mind had finished verifying the math. She heard it begin behind him immediately, the soft percussion of knees on cold stone, not in unison, but in sequence. The way a single stone dropped into still water sends rings outward until they reach the far edge of things. 1, then 2. She kept her eyes on the captain's face and counted by sound. Each one was a separate decision. She understood that, and did not look away from it, and felt the pressure building at the base of her throat, that she would not, in this room, allow to become anything visible. 12 guards, on the floor of the hall of assembly, Before the woman Maren had transported in through the eastern gate at night and planned to chain in front of the council as a demonstration of what institutional power did to inconvenient bloodlines. The captain lifted his head. "The guard," he said, and his voice was entirely steady, "does not bind the blood of the compact." Maren said nothing. She became aware that her hands were shaking. She closed her fingers, and the shaking stopped, and she turned to face the Chancellor, and she looked at him carefully, because this was the version of him she had never been permitted to study, Maren. In the moment after his architecture had been altered by something he had not built into it. He had not moved. This was the thing about him. What fell away from other men in moments of collapse compressed in him, became denser, became more precise. He was watching her with an expression she needed a moment to name, because she had not seen it on him before. It was honest appraisal, not calculation, layered over appraisal, not appraisal subordinated to strategy. The unmediated version. For the first time in her life, Chancellor Maren was simply looking at her. "You didn't know," he said. "No. Your mother kept it from you. She kept me alive." Something crossed his face that, in different circumstances, she might have called pain. She noted it, and did not act on it. "The Council will not accept a guard's recognition as legal validation," he said. "The writ stands. The charges stand. This—" He looked at the 12 men on the floor with the equanimity of a man who is already rebuilding. "This changes the atmosphere. It does not change the law." "The writ," the captain said, "will need to pass through the guard's oversight to be served. That is the founding compact's requirement, unchanged by any Regency Council statute. We do not bypass that process for any order, regardless of its origin." He paused. Regardless. Maren considered him. Then he looked back at her. "Whatever sentiment you've inspired here." "I didn't inspire anything," she said. "I held out my wrists." The hall held that for a moment. Then the north door opened. She had felt the shift before the sound, a change in the room's weight, atmospheric and below the level of naming. The same sense she had felt on the morning her mother pressed something small and hard into her palm in the dark and told her the name of what she was. She turned. Kaelin of Varenhold had come through the king's entrance, which meant the guards posted there had already stepped aside, which meant this was not a matter of rank overriding protocol, but of a decision already made before he arrived. She had known him in the way you know someone who has become significant before you've had the time to examine why. From dispatches that reached even Ashenvale, from the particular quality of one brief meeting 3 days before her exile, from the fact that she had spent an unreasonable portion of the third winter deciding she had constructed that meeting into something it was not. He was not dressed for ceremony. There was frost at the edge of his collar, and he moved with the economy of someone interrupted mid-thought. He stopped when he saw the guards on the floor. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at the chains. "How long have you been back?" he said. Not to the room. To her. "Today." He looked at the chains again, then at Maren. The guard's response to the compact bloodline mark is what the founding oath requires. That is not a refusal of your council order. That is the order performing its original function. Maren's expression did not change. "You're citing founding documents against a sitting Regency Council." "I'm citing founding documents," Kaelin said, "against a writ that was built on a suppressed genealogical record." He said it precisely and only once, the way he apparently said most things. "The record is in the archive. It has been there since before the exile. I've had the documentation for 8 months." The hall's quality of silence changed. "You've been sitting on a succession document for 8 months, Maren said. "I've been verifying it." A pause. "I'm thorough." He crossed the hall. Not quickly. There was nothing performative about it, simply moving toward the position that was, apparently, where he intended to stand. He stopped somewhere between her and Maren, and she noticed that the distance he left between himself and her was specific, deliberate. A position that aligned without presuming. "Your mother wrote a record," he said to her. The hall gave his voice back to itself. "It's sealed in the archive, her marriage registration, your birth record, the mark's documentation, the reason for the concealment." He paused. "And a letter. Sealed separately. I did not read it." She said nothing. "If the document is verified before the council's session," he continued, and his voice carried the hall now, clearly intentional, "the charges do not simply dissolve, they invert. An attempt to suppress a legitimate bloodline claim is covered by the Founding Compact's anti-corruption statutes. The council has jurisdiction, but it is not the jurisdiction Maren has been intending to invoke." Maren was very still. "You have 2 hours before I find a procedural mechanism to seal the archive pending formal review," he said. He said it without anger, without theatre, the honest statement of a man announcing his next move before making it, because concealment had apparently never been his preferred instrument. Possibly less. She looked at Maren. He was already somewhere else behind his eyes. Already, in the next conversation, the next vote, the next institutional lever he had not yet exhausted. She had watched him operate her entire life, and she knew he was not finished, knew this room was not the end of anything, knew that a man who had built his power through information would find other information and other leverage and other mornings before dawn with other warrants. She also knew that for the first time in her life, the architecture of this building was not aligned entirely against her. "This is not finished," she said to him. It was not a warning. It was an acknowledgement. The most honest exchange they had managed, and they both understood what it was. He inclined his head. The gesture was not deference. It was the acknowledgement of a man who has identified the new shape of the game and intends to keep playing it. Then he walked to the north door and the guards moved aside, and he passed through, and the sound of it closing behind him, in the stone space, was clean and absolute. She stood in the hall and breathed. She turned to the captain, who was still on one knee, and said, "Please stand." He stood. The rest followed, the sound of it unhurried. "What you did today," she said, and stopped. The pressure at the base of her throat had nowhere adequate to go, and she did not try to force it. "The council will not receive it well." "The guard's oath was sworn before any sitting council," he said. "My grandfather served when the 13th bloodline disappeared. He wrote about it afterward. He believed it was not an accident. It was not." He nodded once. Not surprise, but confirmation. The expression of a man receiving information he has been holding a space open for. She looked at the chains on the floor. They lay where the captain had set them, the silver-bright links scattered loosely against the dark stone. She had looked at chains like that in the transport, and felt the cold of them, and decided she was finished running. She had not known then what being finished with running looked like. She was beginning to. Kalen had waited. She turned, and he was precisely where she might have expected him to be. Not close, not distant, standing in the particular manner of a person who has arranged themselves without calling attention to the arrangement. She studied him for a moment in the torchlight. The frost was still at his collar. He had come, she understood, from wherever he had been working, when the transport entered the eastern gate, which meant someone had told him the moment she arrived, which meant he had been waiting for that information, which was a thing she was not ready to examine. "The letter," she said. "The archive is 3 floors up." "You said 2 hours." "I said possibly less." She looked at the north door. The letter had been sitting in a sealed room for the entirety of her exile. Through the first winter when she had built walls out of scavenged timber and her hands had bled in the cold. Through the second winter when she had stopped expecting rescue and started expecting simply to survive. Through the third when she had stood at a window watching lantern light approach through snow and understood that the fixed point was always going to require her to walk toward it rather than away. Her mother had written it knowing that, perhaps. Knowing the shape of the daughter the exile would build, or hoping for that shape, or simply doing the only thing available. Sealing a truth in stone and trusting that it would outlast the systems designed to bury it. She did not let herself stand in that thought for long. "The captain," she said, "if Maren moves toward the archive before we reach it." The captain had apparently been waiting for exactly this question. "I understand my oath's implications." She turned to Kaelin and said nothing and walked toward the north door. He fell into step beside her, one pace to her left, and they moved through the hall together and into the corridor beyond it. The narrow service passage, with its orange torchlight turning everything old. Then the servants' stair, rising in tight stone spirals, then a wider passage, with leaded windows, looking out over the inner courtyard, where the snow was still falling, straight and purposeful, covering the cobblestones in something white and new. 3 floors. She had not been in this part of the palace since she was a child, but the stone remembered, or she remembered the stone, the particular way sound absorbed in these upper corridors. The smell of cold and old paper, the faint vibration of the building's age in the walls under her palm when she touched them. Her mother had walked these floors, had made a decision in them that had cost her daughter 3 years of alone and given her, perhaps, everything that alone had forged. She did not know yet how to hold both of those things. She suspected it was going to require more than the remaining hour and whatever minutes Maren's procedural patience allowed. The archive door was iron-bound oak, very old, the lock, a mechanism she did not recognize. Kaelin produced a key that was likewise old, large, iron, worn smooth at the bow from handling. He fit it into the lock, and the mechanism gave, and he stepped aside, and she entered first. The archive was smaller than she had imagined. Shelves from floor to ceiling on 3 walls, the materials sealed in oilcloth against damp, labelled in the cramped hand of archivists working by candlelight across several centuries. The 4th wall held a single table and 2 chairs and a lamp that Kaelin lit from the taper he carried, and the room became warmer and more specific in the light. He found the document without searching. He had been here before, she understood. More than once, the deliberate familiarity of his movements, telling her that whatever he had spent 8 months doing, some portion of it had happened in this room. He set it before her on the table. She sat. He did not. The document was thick, multiple pages sewn together with waxed thread, the outer cover marked with a seal she recognized as her mother's, the impression of a ring her mother had worn on her right hand, which had seemed unremarkable until she was old enough to understand that the pattern pressed into the wax was not decorative. She broke the seal. Her mother's handwriting was very clear. She had written it carefully, which told Alara something. Her mother's handwriting, under urgency, became angular and compressed. But this was her deliberate hand, the one she used for correspondence. She intended to outlast the circumstances of its composition. The marriage record first, the year, the names, the bloodline registration. Then her birth. The mark described in the precise language of the compact's own genealogical code. The language used in the founding documents that lined the walls of this very room, as though her mother had understood that if the notation matched the legal standard exactly, it could not be dismissed as informal record-keeping. Then the concealment. Not an apology for it, not a plea, simply a record of why. stated in the flat, declarative tone of a woman who has made a decision and does not intend to spend the remainder of her document regretting it. And then the letter. It was sealed separately, as he had said, with the same ring but a different impression. The private version of the seal. The one her mother used for correspondence that was not intended to be read by anyone before the intended recipient. She opened it, and the paper was thinner than the genealogical record, worn at the fold from being handled before sealing, and she thought of her mother sitting somewhere in this building with this page and writing it and folding it and pressing the seal into the wax and placing it inside the larger document and walking away from it. She read it. She read it twice. She did not read it a third time because the second reading had given her everything it was going to give, and reading it further would be a way of avoiding what came after, and her mother had specifically, in the final lines, named that tendency in her and asked her to resist it. She set it down. Caelan had not moved. He had stationed himself near the door, facing away from her, with the studied deliberateness of a person who has decided that a specific kind of distance is what the moment requires and who is going to hold it for as long as needed. She was aware of him, the way she was aware of the lamp, as a source of warmth that she was not going to acknowledge aloud, because acknowledging it was a different kind of decision, and she was not, in this particular hour, positioned to make it. But she was aware of it. She knew I'd be exiled, she said. His head turned slightly, not enough to look at her. Listening, she writes that she knew that the exile was coming before the warrant arrived, that she had arranged the archive registration because she understood the only thing that would outlast Maren's institutional reach was the founding compact's own legal structure. She paused. She writes that she chose not to tell me what I was because she believed I needed to not know in order to survive being alone. That knowing would have made me try to return too early, before there was anything in place to return to. He was very still. She was right, Alara said. She said it without bitterness and without the particular inflection of a person forgiving something, because it was not a forgiveness. It was simply true. The way the scar on her left thumb was true, and the mark on her wrist was true, and the 3 years were true. I would have come back in the first winter. I would have walked straight into what Maren had waiting. And now, he said, the archive is verified, the guard has made their position known, and Maren's writ has approximately 40 minutes before its procedural basis dissolves. And Maren has approximately 40 minutes to build the next one. Yes. She looked at the letter in her hands, her mother's deliberate handwriting, the final lines. She had not read them a third time, but she did not need to. They were already the kind of words that settle into the body rather than residing in memory. She had asked her daughter not to be careful, in the way of women who survive by making themselves small. She had asked her to be careful in the way of women who have decided what they are worth and intend to cost accordingly. Alara folded the letter and placed it in the interior pocket of her coat, close against her ribs. She stood. The council convenes at the second hour, she said, in the great hall, the public hall. He turned fully now. Not the chamber. Maren scheduled it in the public hall, which I believe he intended as a demonstration, a formal humiliation witnessed by the court. Then it will be witnessed by the court. He looked at her carefully. He was doing the thing she had noticed in the hall below, the assessment that was entirely present, nothing withheld to seem unaffected, and she let him do it because she had nothing left to conceal, and she was tired of concealment's posture. The guard will be present, he said. I know. The council has 4 votes against 3. Maren will arrive with documentation prepared. His legal arguments will be thorough. I know. When he makes them, in front of the court, he will make them, she said. He will make all of them. He has had 3 years to prepare them, the same 3 years I had to become whatever I needed to become to walk back through that eastern gate. She looked at the genealogical record on the table. Her mother's careful notation, the bloodline code that matched the founding compact's language exactly, that had been sitting in this room through every Regency Council vote, and every warrant, and every winter she had survived alone. When Maren has finished, I am going to present this document and my mother's letter and the captain's testimony, and I am going to let the founding compact speak for itself. She picked up the genealogical record and held it. And when that is done, I am not going to remove Maren from his position. He was very still. He will expect removal, she said. He has built every contingency around removal, the response to it, the alliances that would activate against it, the counter-narrative already drafted. What he has not built a contingency for is being left in place. She met his eyes. Under oversight that the founding compact explicitly authorizes, watched, constrained, unable to operate through the darkness he requires, because the darkness has been removed. She paused. A man who controls institutions is most dangerous when he controls them invisibly. Make the visibility permanent, and you have not destroyed his power. You have transformed it into something accountable. The silence that followed was very full. That, Kaelin said, after a moment, is considerably more dangerous to him than exile. Yes. He looked at her, with an expression she could not entirely read, which she found against her intentions, against the 3 years of learning to need nothing that could be taken away. More significant than the expression she could. There was something in it that was not admiration, which she would have been wary of, and not calculation, which she would have been warier of still. It was simply the expression of a man encountering something that has confirmed, at last, what he had been holding space open for. She did not let herself stand in that for long either. "The second hour," she said. 20 minutes. She moved toward the door, the genealogical record in her hands, her mother's letter against her ribs, and the letter's final line moving through her like a current she did not intend to name aloud. That the 13th bloodline had never been destroyed, had simply been waiting for a daughter who had survived enough to be worth what it would cost her, and that her mother had believed, with the specific faith of a woman who has gambled everything on a single sealed document and a sleeping archive, that that daughter would be exactly what she needed to be. The corridor outside the archive was cold. The leaded window at its end showed the courtyard below, the snow still falling, the cobblestones now fully covered and white and unmarked, as though the city had been asked to begin its accounting from this morning rather than from any morning before it. She did not stop. Behind her, she heard Kaelin pull the archive door closed, heard the key turn in the iron lock, and then his footsteps on the stone, unhurried even, falling into the rhythm of hers. And they moved together toward the stair that led down toward the great hall, toward the council, toward Maren, with 40 minutes, and whatever he had managed to build in them, toward the court that would witness what came next. The chains were still on the floor of the hall of assembly, 3 flights below. No one had been sent to retrieve them. She had not expected that anyone would.